He thought she was just another exhausted soul in the hospital waiting room, but she already knew everything about him. A grieving father, a terminally ill child, and a stranger who wasn't there by accident. But what no one knew was who she really was. What would you do if a complete stranger knew the darkest chapters of your past? Would you trust them or run the other way? This isn't just a story about secrets. It's a story about how far someone will go to protect the truth. Before we dive in, where are you watching from, and what kind of story do you want to see next? Drop it in the comments. And if stories like this pull you in and don't let go, go ahead, hit subscribe. I have another powerful one coming tomorrow. And you really don't want to miss it. Now, let's get into today's story. He didn't notice her at first. Not really. When your 6-year-old is curled up on your lap, radiating heat like a furnace, the rest of the world becomes background noise. The cheap fluorescent lights, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the endless echo of announcements calling out names that weren't his, they all blurred into a kind of waking dream. Ronnie's arms ached from holding Jessica, but he couldn't let go. Every time he adjusted her, she whimpered, half asleep, half suffering, and he whispered to her in that hoarse, cracked voice of a parent running on fumes and fear. It had been almost 2 days since the fever started. It spiked fast. Too fast. He tried everything. Cold compresses, lukewarm baths, even sitting in the ER for 6 hours the night before, only to be told they were at capacity. Come back if it gets worse, they said. It got worse. Now here they were. New hospital. Same questions. Same looks from overworked nurses. And Ronnie, stuck in a chair that dug into his spine, counting the minutes while time moved like molasses. And that's when she arrived. She didn't make a sound. No scuff of shoes on linoleum, no rustling of a purse. Just a quiet presence that slipped into the chair next to his like a shadow. At first, Ronnie barely registered it. Another parent, maybe. Another person waiting for someone they loved. But then she smiled. He turned his head just enough to glimpse her. Red hair, deep green dress. Not hospital scrubs, not a doctor. Her posture was elegant, too elegant for someone who had spent any amount of time in a place like this. And her eyes? They weren't scanning the waiting room like the others. They were fixed on Jessica. Soft. Curious. Almost sad. Ronnie gave a tight nod, the universal I started to chat gesture. She didn't say anything back. Just that smile again, quiet, knowing, like she already understood something about him he hadn't said out loud. It should have made him uncomfortable. It didn't. Something about her presence was oddly calming, like a cool cloth on the back of his neck. She didn't pull out a phone. She didn't fidget. She just sat there, with this stillness that felt completely out of place in a hospital pulsing with desperation. Ronnie blinked hard, tried to clear the fog. He wasn't sure how long he'd been staring, but Jessica stirred in his lap, her tiny hand clutching tighter to his shirt. Her lips moved in a whisper he couldn't quite hear, and he leaned down. "Daddy." His throat caught. Her skin was burning. He looked up, expecting the woman to have turned away by now. But she hadn't. She was still watching. Most people would have politely looked away, pretended not to notice. But she didn't. There was no judgment in her face. No awkward sympathy. Just that same, knowing. It hit Ronnie then. The kind of tired he was feeling, it wasn't just physical. It was grief. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from doing everything right and still losing. He hadn't felt this hollow since the funeral. He shifted Jessica in his lap and gave her bare, soft, worn, missing an ear, a little squeeze into her arms. She didn't stir. That's when the woman beside him finally spoke. "Long night." Her voice was low. Not invasive. Just enough to acknowledge the space they now shared. Ronnie gave a half laugh, the kind that tastes bitter. Something like that. He didn't elaborate. And she didn't press. In some way, it felt like she already knew. The rings under his eyes. The tangled mess of hair that hadn't seen a comb in 2 days. The look you get when you've held it together for too long, and you're 1 second away from falling apart. "I'm Carrie," she said after a moment, her voice gentle. He hesitated. "Ronnie." A pause. "She yours?" She nodded toward Jessica. "Yeah," he said. And for some reason, that one word cracked something in his chest. He didn't mean to keep talking, but the silence made space for it. "Her mom passed last year," he said. "Cancer. The kind that takes everything before you even know what's happening." Carrie didn't blink. She didn't recoil. She just listened. Ronnie hadn't told that to anyone here. Not the nurses. Not the admissions clerk. But he just told her. Why? There was something about her, like she'd been in this waiting room 1,000 times before. Like she knew what it was to watch someone slip away and be completely helpless to stop it. She looks strong, Carrie said, nodding toward Jessica. Ronnie swallowed hard. She is. They sat in silence after that. Not awkward. Not heavy. Just two strangers, suspended in the same timeless bubble, surrounded by beeping machines and whispered prayers. Ronnie didn't know it then. But Carrie wasn't a stranger. Not really. And she hadn't come here by accident. The real nightmare hadn't begun when Jessica got sick. It began the moment Carrie McKinney sat down beside him, smiling like fate had finally caught up. And she wasn't here to help. Not in the way he thought. She was here to watch. She said her name was Carrie. No last name. Just Carrie. Ronnie didn't think much of that at first. Maybe she was one of those people who kept things simple. The kind who left off last names like they didn't matter, like she didn't need to be traced or remembered. But later, he'd think about that detail again and again. Why no last name? Why not even a pause before she answered? At the time, though, it slipped past him. His mind was too clouded, too frayed at the edges to pick up on something that obvious. The kind of detail that only feels loud when you look back with hindsight burning a hole through your chest. What stood out more, even then, was what she didn't do. Ronnie had been in that waiting room long enough to learn the patterns. People either stared at their phones like they were waiting for someone to text them out of this nightmare or paced the tile floor, chewing their nails down to nothing. But Carrie didn't move like she was anxious. She didn't fidget or scroll or check the clock every 2 minutes. She was perfectly still, too still, and her eyes? They didn't wander. They stayed on the room, on the nurses, on Jessica, and on him. Not in a creepy way. Not like someone casing the place. But with this weird sense of awareness. As if she were taking mental photographs of everything, storing away conversations, filing faces into categories. She was quiet, but not absent. She was present in a way that felt deliberate. And Ronnie didn't know what to make of it. Until Jessica let out a soft whimper. Ronnie tightened his grip, rocking her just a little. She'd been drifting in and out of restless sleep for hours, flushed and trembling, her stuffed bear crushed beneath her arm. The sounds she made weren't loud, but they cut straight through his chest like glass. He looked down at her, helpless again. What else could he do? He'd done everything. He just needed someone, anyone, to tell him she was going to be okay. And then, something strange happened. Carrie reached into her purse and pulled out a tiny packet of tissues. She didn't say anything. She didn't even make a sound. She just extended the packet in his direction, eyes warm but unreadable. He hesitated for a second. Then nodded, almost apologetically, and took it. Thanks, he murmured. No problem, she said. Calm. Clean. No emotional weight. Like she'd done this before. Like she'd been in this exact position 100 times with strangers whose lives were crumbling in front of her. There was something in the way she offered comfort. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to keep him from unraveling. That should have been his first real clue. People don't get that good at knowing what to say unless it's part of their job. But again, he missed it. Jessica shifted again, her face tightening as she let out a low, painful whimper. That's when Carrie leaned over, just a little, and said the one thing Ronnie never expected. She reminds me of my niece, she whispered. Her voice was soft but clear. And that sentence, it sounded true. It sounded lived in. But Ronnie wouldn't realize until much later how carefully chosen those words were. Just enough personal detail to sound real, not enough to be traceable. He looked over at her, finally seeing her more fully. The deep green dress wasn't something you wore to a hospital unless you were coming from somewhere else, or hiding behind something else. Her posture was too polished. Her shoes too clean. Not even a scuff on the heel. And her eyes, well, they held more than they gave away. He nodded. She's tough, he said, almost defensively. She's been through more than any 6-year-old should have to. I can tell, Carrie replied. Not in a patronizing way. In a way that made him feel seen. Safe. And that's the thing. Ronnie didn't feel safe often anymore. Not since Emily died. Not since he'd been left to navigate the world alone with a little girl who looked like her mother and carried the same stubborn spirit. But sitting there, next to a stranger in green with a voice like a lullaby and eyes that seemed to understand too much, he felt his shoulders drop an inch. Just one. Just enough to exhale. Looking back, he'd wonder, was that part of the game? The charm? The method? Because if it was, it worked. Now let me ask you something. If you were sitting in that waiting room, exhausted, scared, unraveling, and someone like Carrie sat beside you, smiled just right, and said just the right thing, would you have let your guard down too? Be honest. Tell me in the comments. Because what Ronnie didn't know, and what you probably don't realize yet, is that Carrie McKinney wasn't just good at reading people. She was trained for it. And every word out of her mouth had a purpose. She didn't come here to offer comfort. She came here to surveil a man who, according to a government file locked behind 5 levels of clearance, might have been the last link in a very dangerous chain. But more on that in just a moment. The word hit the air like a knife, soft but sharp, and time seemed to hold its breath. Mommy. It escaped Jessica's lips so faintly that it might have been missed in a noisier room, but in that waiting area, the kind where the quiet presses in on your chest, it rang out like a siren. Ronnie stiffened immediately. His arms wrapped tighter around her, not protectively, but reflexively, like he needed to hold something tangible so he wouldn't fall apart. That one word, just one syllable really, had the power to gut him. It took him back to the last night he held Emily's hand, her grip weakening, her breath staggered, her smile trying to stay brave for Jessica's sake. She was the kind of woman who could endure unimaginable pain and still whisper to their daughter, "It's going to be okay." But it wasn't okay. It never had been since. And now, hearing that word from Jessica's mouth, half asleep, half lost in fever dreams, Ronnie couldn't breathe. Carrie didn't ask questions. She didn't offer some bland cookie-cutter comfort like most strangers might, "She's in a better place," or "Stay strong." No, she didn't say anything at all. She just reached into her purse again and handed over another tissue, this time more deliberately. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, something deeper than conversation, heavier than sympathy. She knew. Ronnie looked at her, really looked this time. Her expression was perfectly still. No pity. No awkward discomfort. Just recognition. The kind of recognition you only find in people who've watched someone they love disappear slowly, while the world kept turning like nothing was happening. Maybe she'd lost someone too. Maybe she hadn't. But either way, she knew how to carry someone else's grief without flinching. That was rare. He took the tissue and nodded, unable to form words. Carrie gave the smallest nod back, as if to say, "You don't have to explain. I get it." And that somehow was worse than anything she could have said out loud. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was shared. A kind of quiet that belongs to people who know loss and still manage to sit beside it without turning away. And as strange as it was, Ronnie felt something inside him start to loosen, not collapse but soften. Now here's the thing. What Carrie did in that moment wasn't accidental. It wasn't impulsive. It was precise. Calculated, even. She'd been trained to recognize these openings, the small cracks where a person's armor starts to split. But what made Carrie different, what made her dangerous, wasn't just the training. It was that she felt things too. That's what complicated the mission. Carrie McKinney had read everything there was to know about Ronnie Barnes before she even stepped foot in that waiting room. She'd memorized the details. Former Marine, honorable discharge. Widowed. Worked construction off the books since Emily passed. No priors. No red flags, except one. His wife's brother, Alan Drexler. That name meant something to people in her world. It was buried in encrypted databases, coded in aliases, tied to a digital leak that nearly cost lives overseas. And someone believed Ronnie might have had contact. Maybe knowingly, maybe not. But that was all it took to justify eyes on him. Which meant Carrie's job was simple: get close. Observe. Build rapport. Confirm or eliminate suspicion. But something about Ronnie complicated everything. Because the man sitting in front of her wasn't some hardened criminal, wasn't slick or evasive. He was tired. Broken. Human. And when Jessica whispered for a mother she'd never see again, something in Carrie's chest clenched in a way it hadn't in years. This next part? It's where everything started to tilt. When Carrie made her first real mistake. Not a tactical one. An emotional one. She stopped watching Ronnie like a target. She started watching him like a man. And that's where her control began to slip. That 5-second moment, that whisper from Jessica, that tissue exchange, that look, would mark the beginning of a shift that no one at Langley could have predicted. Because when you're in deep cover, the first rule is simple: never let it get personal. But Carrie had just crossed that line. And there was no going back. And while Ronnie sat in that cold hospital chair, trying to keep his daughter from slipping into the kind of fever that steals children in silence, Carrie wasn't there out of empathy. She wasn't waiting for test results or a loved one in surgery. She wasn't lost. She was planted. Methodically. Strategically. Every detail of her presence in that building was engineered for proximity. To him. She knew the layout of the hospital before ever walking through the sliding glass doors. She knew which nurse would be stationed at the triage desk and how often security rotated shifts. She knew that Ronnie would return that night, because the agency's predictive behavior model said he would, and because desperate fathers don't just disappear. They circle back. They cling to what little hope they have left. And right on cue, he did. That green dress? Not a random choice. Psychological studies showed men under stress responded with more openness to calming colors: green, blue, soft earth tones. It was tailored to appear effortless, approachable, just enough formality to project confidence, not enough to trigger suspicion. The shoes were soft-soled, made to move without sound, and the purse? It wasn't for makeup or snacks. It housed a covert recorder, a secure comm, and a biometric scanner disguised as a compact mirror. Carrie had played the role dozens of times before: undercover therapist, exhausted traveler, concerned teacher. But this one? It was different. This assignment required patience, empathy. It required the kind of intimacy that made even her superiors flinch when they signed off on it. Because Ronnie Barnes wasn't just some random person of interest. He was potentially the last thread leading to something far bigger, a cyberweapon stolen from a military server 2 years earlier. The kind of code that, in the wrong hands, could shut down power grids across entire continents. It had vanished without a trace, until one name surfaced again and again in the metadata: Alan Drexler. Ronnie's brother-in-law. The same man who disappeared shortly after Emily's funeral. The agency had no concrete proof that Ronnie was involved. No transactions. No flagged communications. No direct ties to the black market forums where Drexler was last seen. But that's what made it suspicious. It was too clean. And when things are that clean in intelligence, they're usually hiding something messy. Carrie had read the entire dossier, twice. She knew what he did in the Marines, where he grew up, what high school he dropped out of when his mom got sick. She knew the names of the construction foremen who sometimes paid him under the table, the brand of cereal his daughter preferred, even the route he took to avoid traffic on the way to Jessica's school. This wasn't surveillance. It was dissection. And still, she couldn't reconcile what she saw on paper with what she saw in that waiting room. The man in the file was a potential collaborator. The man holding his daughter like the world might end if he blinked was something else. Now I know what you might be thinking. How can someone trained to manipulate, to stay emotionally distant, to execute orders without pause, start to feel something real? That's the question, isn't it? Because here's the truth. No amount of training can fully erase humanity. You can teach someone how to kill, how to lie, how to vanish. But you can't unteach instinct. And when Carrie watched Ronnie wipe tears off his daughter's forehead with the edge of his sleeve, gently, like he was afraid even the fabric might hurt her, something in her shifted. That's where the problem started. It's not that Carrie forgot her mission. It's that she started seeing beyond it. And in this line of work, empathy isn't a strength. It's a crack in the armor. The kind of crack that can get people killed. But she didn't pull back. She leaned in. And now I want to throw this to you. If you were tasked with watching someone who looked entirely innocent, but your orders told you otherwise, would you trust what you saw? Or what you were told? Drop your answer in the comments. Be honest. Because this story is about more than surveillance. It's about judgment, about trust, and about what happens when those two collide in the most dangerous way possible. Back in the hospital, Ronnie had no idea the woman sitting beside him could dismantle an encrypted server with a flash drive or slip a tracker into his jacket without him noticing. He didn't know she'd already been in his apartment 2 nights earlier, while he and Jessica were at the pharmacy. He didn't even realize she'd chosen that exact moment, after Jessica's fever peaked, after his guard was at its lowest, to make contact. Because that's how good she was. But beneath all that professionalism, beneath the carefully rehearsed lines and the pre-approved facial expressions, Carrie was starting to lose control. Because what no one told her when she signed up for this op was how much it would hurt to care. And by the time she realized it, it was already too late. And that changed everything. Because let's be honest, no one wakes up thinking they'll be targeted by the CIA. Especially not a man like Ronnie Barnes. He was the kind of guy who kept his head down, paid cash, kept receipts in an old shoebox instead of trusting apps or cloud storage. Since losing Emily, his world had shrunk to two priorities: keep Jessica safe and survive the day. That was it. No politics. No systems to hack. No late-night dealings in alleyways or hidden USBs taped under benches. Just playgrounds, grocery runs, and a barely working truck with one good tire and three prayerful ones. But what Ronnie didn't know, what would have shattered the fragile sense of normalcy he'd been clinging to, was that his dead wife's brother had become the subject of one of the most highly classified investigations in North America. Alan Drexler wasn't just missing. He had vanished with stolen access credentials tied to a top-secret digital architecture capable of infiltrating the energy grid. We're not talking phishing emails or ransomware. This was nation-breaking stuff. The kind of code that doesn't just destroy infrastructure, it makes it vanish silently. And according to the last decrypted ping off Drexler's burner, the location was just 8 miles from where Ronnie lived. Coincidence? The agency didn't think so. Which brings us to the question, why him? Why surveil a grieving father with no known criminal history, who worked under the table to keep his daughter fed? Because it was never about Ronnie. Not entirely. It was about what Alan might have left behind, and who he trusted enough to hide it. See, Alan and Ronnie weren't close, at least not on paper. But during Emily's final months, Alan was always around. Helping with Jessica. Delivering groceries. Fixing things Ronnie didn't have the bandwidth to deal with. It looked like kindness. But kindness, in retrospect, can look an awful lot like placement. The agency flagged one strange detail. Alan never used his primary devices around his own apartment. He always checked in on work calls from the Barnes house. Wi-Fi logs showed devices connecting at odd hours. One, encrypted to the teeth, accessed only twice, 3 months before Emily died. And then, never again. That was enough. Enough to open a full investigation. Enough to pull in a digital forensics team who scoured every byte of Ronnie's internet history. Enough to assign someone like Carrie to go in, blend in, and earn his trust. You may be asking yourself, wasn't that overkill? Wasn't it possible Alan had acted alone, and Ronnie was just the unfortunate family connection? Sure, it was possible. But in the intelligence world, possible doesn't get you clearance. Possible gets people killed. So they needed confirmation. Which is why Carrie had been briefed, trained, and sent in with one clear objective: observe Ronnie until he either broke, or proved beyond doubt he had no idea what Alan was really doing. And Ronnie? He was just doing his best to keep Jessica breathing. Every hour she spent curled against his chest, burning up, the walls of his world pulled tighter. The room, the noise, the dry mouth from too much coffee and too little sleep, it all blurred into static. But not Carrie. Carrie was still sharp. Still present. Watching him. Analyzing everything. And yet, the more she watched, the harder it became to believe he was capable of deception. He didn't hide things well. If anything, he was too open. His grief spilled out in half-sentences and quiet sighs. He wasn't a man holding secrets. He was a man held together by the thinnest thread. Still, Carrie couldn't let down her guard. Not fully. Not yet. Because here's the thing about intelligence work. The most dangerous people don't always look dangerous. Sometimes they look like your neighbor. Or a schoolteacher. Or a man cradling his daughter in a hospital waiting room. Because Carrie was about to learn that instinct, no matter how sharp, doesn't always lead you where you think. And Ronnie? Well, he was about to say something that would flip the entire operation on its head. Carrie McKinney had operated in war zones where the only language spoken was survival. She'd been dropped behind enemy lines, flown under fake identities, hacked into secure databases with lives on the line, and walked out of buildings that were about to be wiped off the map. She had disarmed bombs, bluffed arms dealers, and held her breath in rooms where one wrong word would have meant death. But nothing, and she meant nothing, had prepared her for the helplessness of sitting on a plastic hospital chair, watching a little girl burn up in her father's arms. Because it wasn't the mission that was breaking her. It was the humanity of it. Ronnie wasn't just another variable in a dangerous equation. He was someone's entire world. And that someone, Jessica, had eyes too big for her small face and a voice that rasped out words like mommy in her sleep with the kind of longing that carved into Carrie's ribs. It was like the weight of this assignment wasn't on her shoulders, it had sunk into her chest, into her lungs. Every cough Jessica gave made her flinch inside. Every time Ronnie shifted to try and get her more comfortable, Carrie felt herself lean toward them involuntarily. Not as an agent. Not as a spy. As a human being. And that was dangerous. The agency hadn't prepared her for this. For what it would feel like to sit this close to the center of someone's collapse and pretend she wasn't moved. Her cover story, kindly stranger, harmless woman waiting for a friend in surgery, was airtight. She'd practiced it 100 times. But now, every line felt heavier. Every word she spoke to Ronnie took longer to form because she had to sift through what she wanted to say and what she was supposed to say. She'd crossed lines before. Ethics, legality, even morality when the situation demanded it. But this wasn't about following orders anymore. This was about watching a man quietly shatter for the sake of a daughter who might not make it through the night. And the worst part? She believed him. Every time Ronnie spoke about his late wife, Carrie believed him. When he looked at Jessica like she was the only thread keeping him tethered to the world, she didn't see a liar. She saw a man drowning with no one left to reach for but his child. So tell me, if you were her, would you have trusted the file? The mission? Or the man breaking in front of you? Really think about it. Put yourself in her shoes and tell me in the comments, could you lie to someone who trusted you just to get what you needed? Because that's what Carrie was trained to do. That's what the mission required. And that's exactly what she was failing to do now. She found herself hesitating before every move. Second-guessing choices. Watching Ronnie speak not through the lens of an analyst, but through the raw filter of someone who'd once lost someone too. She remembered the phone call she got at Langley, how her older sister had died in a car crash while Carrie was halfway around the world planting surveillance gear in a hotel suite. She hadn't even been able to come back for the funeral. That guilt? It lived in her. And now, it looked an awful lot like Jessica. Maybe that's why she couldn't walk away. Maybe that's why she wasn't following protocol. Because every minute she sat beside Ronnie and saw the hope draining from his face, she wasn't just watching a potential informant, she was watching a father on the edge of collapse. Still, there were updates to send. Logs to file. Tiny coded messages she typed out from the privacy of the women's bathroom every few hours. Her handler wanted movement. Confirmation. Access. She was supposed to be extracting something, anything. But all she kept reporting were emotional observations. Notes that sounded less like a field agent and more like someone struggling through a diary entry. And yet, she couldn't tell them what was really going on inside her. Because the truth? Carrie wasn't sure whose side she was on anymore. Ronnie's honesty had a weight to it. He wasn't smooth. He wasn't calculated. If he was hiding something, he was either the greatest actor in the world, or he didn't even know he had it. And both of those possibilities were worse than anything in the file. What if Alan had planted something in Ronnie's home without him knowing? What if Jessica had seen something she didn't understand? A code. A file. A name she repeated in her sleep? The unknowns were piling up fast. And Carrie, she was running out of distance between herself and the man she was supposed to be manipulating. So now the question shifts to you. What happens when someone trained to infiltrate starts to care? What do you do when the mission begins to erode under the weight of actual connection? Drop your thoughts below. Because Carrie was about to make a choice that would either save 2 innocent lives, or blow the entire op to pieces. The line came out smoother than she expected. It wasn't rehearsed, not one of those pre-cleared responses built to slide into casual conversation unnoticed. It came from somewhere else, deeper. Maybe it was her own exhaustion, or maybe it was the way Ronnie had started to open up, bit by bit, as if peeling himself back layer after layer wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. He'd asked quietly, in that vulnerable lull between midnight and morning when the fluorescent lights flickered above and the nurse's footsteps slowed to a tired shuffle. So what do you do? His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Jessica was still asleep in his arms, head tucked into the curve of his shoulder like a wounded bird. Carrie didn't hesitate. I used to be a teacher. There it was. Crisp. Clean. Not entirely untrue. But the moment it left her lips, something inside her twisted. Because she didn't mean it the way it sounded. She wasn't talking about briefing CIA operatives on advanced psychological manipulation techniques or walking them through the art of extracting confessions without a subject ever realizing they'd been broken. No, in that moment, she wanted to be the kind of teacher who kept stickers in her desk drawer. The kind who clapped erasers together at the end of the day and whispered encouragement to shy kids before spelling tests. She wanted to be that version of herself, one she'd never actually been. But Ronnie didn't question it. He smiled, worn but genuine, and said, "Figures. You've got that calm thing teachers have. You're good with people." And it was that sentence, Not the lie that landed hardest. Because it wasn't flattery. It was observation. The kind you only make when you're looking closely. And Ronnie had been watching her more than she realized. That was the first moment she wondered if maybe he suspected something. Or maybe he just saw her. Not the cover story. Not the mission. Just her. "Did you ever think about going back to it?" he asked, rocking Jessica slightly, almost absently. Carrie looked at the girl's flushed cheeks, her damp hair matted to her forehead. Her breath came shallow but steady. "No," Carrie answered after a long pause. "I don't think I'd be very good at it now." He chuckled. "You don't forget how to be good at something. You just forget why you started." That one stuck with her. Because she had forgotten. Or maybe she'd buried it. The why. The part of her that once believed in what she did. Why she joined the agency. Why she endured years of brutal training, moral compromise, lies stacked on lies until the truth stopped feeling solid. She told herself it was about protecting people, about preventing disasters before they happened. But looking at Ronnie, barely holding himself together in a place where the clock never moved and the answers never came, she realized something gutting. She wasn't protecting him. She was the threat in the room. Sometimes the softest lies are the ones we tell ourselves. Carrie kept playing the part, asking just enough questions to keep the conversation going, never steering too far, always careful to listen more than she spoke. But in those quiet moments, when the buzz of the hospital dimmed and Ronnie let his guard down, she caught herself wanting to tell him the truth. Wanting him to know that someone somewhere thought he mattered enough to watch. Wanting him to understand that even though he felt forgotten, he was far from invisible. But she couldn't. Not yet. That lie, the teacher lie, was now the only bridge between them. And she needed it to hold a little longer. For the mission. For Jessica. Maybe even for herself. Because if she told the truth, everything would collapse. Not just the operation, not just her cover. But whatever strange fragile connection had formed between them in that stale hospital corridor lit by the dim flicker of hope and heartbreak. And Carrie wasn't ready to lose that. Not yet. Because with every passing hour, Ronnie looked less like a person of interest. And more like the kind of man she'd wished existed in the world a little more often. And Jessica? She wasn't just a data point on a case file anymore. She was real. And she deserved better than secrets. But for now, Carrie only had one choice. Keep lying. Keep being the soft-spoken stranger in green. Because once the truth came out, nothing between them would ever be the same again. It started with a sigh, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than exhaustion. It was closer to surrender, the kind of breath you take when you finally give yourself permission to bleed a little in front of someone else. The waiting room was quiet, unnaturally so. Jessica was asleep again, her fever down slightly thanks to the latest round of meds, and the nurses had stopped hovering. Carrie had just come back from the vending machine, a lukewarm cup of coffee in one hand and a tiny foil-wrapped brownie in the other, when Ronnie broke the silence that had stretched between them for the last 30 minutes. "She was strong, you know," he said, eyes fixed on a crack in the floor tile. "Stronger than me. Always was." Carrie sat beside him slowly, careful not to rush the moment. She said nothing. Just opened the brownie, placed it on a napkin between them, and waited. He didn't look at her. But that was okay. Some stories are too raw to tell while making eye contact. She got the diagnosis in October. Pancreatic. Stage 4. It was already too late. They said 6 months, but we barely made it to 3. The words didn't come all at once. They stumbled, paused, reshaped themselves in his throat before being released like jagged stones, too sharp to swallow but too painful to keep in. "She made me promise I wouldn't fall apart in front of Jess. Said kids remember how you react more than what you say." He rubbed his hands together. His palms were dry, cracked. A working man's hands. Hands that had held on to grief longer than any man should have to. "So I waited until bedtime," he continued. "I'd tuck her in, read that dumb book about the bear who loses his shoes, then sit in the garage for hours, just staring at the floor, trying not to break." Carrie felt her own throat tighten, her breath catching slightly. She turned her gaze forward, matching his posture, shoulder to shoulder but not touching. She didn't dare move. "She died in our bed," Ronnie whispered, holding Jess's hand. That's how she wanted it. Said she wanted the last thing she felt to be her daughter. A beat. And the last thing I saw was the light go out of her eyes. It would have been easy, too easy, for Carrie to pivot. To shift the conversation back to safer ground. That's what she'd been trained to do. Let someone vent, then steer. Use emotion to soften resistance, but never let it tether you. But in that moment, she couldn't. Because she wasn't just watching a subject open up. She was standing at the edge of a man's buried world, and he was handing her the shovel. I was angry for a long time, Ronnie said. Not at her. Just at everything. The doctors. The timing. The fact that she left me here to raise a little girl I don't know if I'm strong enough to protect. His voice cracked on the word protect. That was when Carrie looked over. Really looked. And what she saw wasn't just grief, it was fear. A quiet, unspoken terror that he'd already failed Jessica in ways no one had the heart to tell him. And that's when Carrie did the one thing she never thought she'd do on a mission. She reached out and rested her hand on his. Just for a second. He didn't pull away. I don't think she would have picked anyone else, Carrie said softly, shocking even herself with how real the words felt. He gave a tired smile, the kind that says thank you when words aren't enough. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever told someone a truth you didn't expect to share? Maybe you were tired. Maybe you needed someone, even for a moment. Tell me in the comments. I'm curious, who do we really open up to when no one else is listening? Ronnie finished the coffee in one long swallow. The bitter taste didn't seem to bother him. Jess never cries about it, he said. She keeps it all in. But sometimes, I'll hear her whisper to the bear at night, telling it secrets, talking to it like it's her mom. Carrie felt a sudden rush of guilt. That bear, Jessica's constant companion, was listed in the surveillance logs. They had even considered replacing it once, hiding a listening device inside. It was only because of Carrie's personal veto that they didn't. At the time, it felt like a calculated move to build trust. Now, it felt like a betrayal too far. As Ronnie drifted into silence again, Carrie felt something shift inside her, not in a strategic sense, not professionally, but personally. She was beginning to realize this wasn't just a case anymore. This was a man mourning the love of his life. This was a little girl trying to be brave when she didn't have to be. And she, Carrie, was the one person in the room who could destroy what little peace they had left. But for the first time in her career, she didn't know if she could keep doing it. Because listening to Ronnie speak about Emily made her feel something she hadn't expected to feel for a subject. Loyalty. And once that sets in, the mission starts to fall apart. If this already has you on edge, wait until you find out what Carrie does next. Subscribe, because this one spirals into something you won't see coming. The alert came through like a pulse, subtle, encrypted, disguised as a mundane message from a ride-sharing app. But to Carrie, it was louder than a siren. She didn't have to open the secure folder. She already knew what was inside. The final green light. The team had reviewed everything she'd sent, voice samples, his browsing data, the interaction logs, even the emotional notations she wasn't supposed to be submitting but had anyway. They had seen enough. And in their eyes, Ronnie wasn't just an emotional man with a sick daughter. He was a liability. A breach waiting to happen. That red folder sitting in the back of her mind, the one with contingency protocols, had always been hypothetical. She never thought it would come to this. Not after everything she'd seen. Not after what he'd just told her about Emily. Not after Jessica had fallen asleep clutching her father's hand like it was the only anchor she had left in the world. But the agency wasn't interested in feelings. They dealt in risk. Cold, clinical probabilities. And right now, the probability that Ronnie knew something, even if he didn't realize it, was too high to ignore. Carrie felt it in her gut before she even read the words. Green for pickup. 0400. Non-cooperative scenario approved. Daughter to be held for safety leverage if necessary. It hit her like a punch to the chest. That last line wasn't protocol, it was cruelty. The kind that usually came from upstairs, from people who made decisions with zero context and even less conscience. She wanted to scream, but she didn't. She just sat there, phone in hand, pretending to scroll. Ronnie was across the room now, leaning back in his chair, his jacket draped over Jessica like a makeshift blanket. His head tilted slightly, the weight of too many sleepless nights finally pressing down. And Jessica? She was still burning up, but she'd stopped whimpering. For the first time in days, she looked at peace. And yet, in less than 4 hours, that peace would be shattered. Unless Carrie did something. You ever feel that moment when two versions of you fight inside the same skin? The trained operative versus the person who just wants to do the right thing? That was her in that chair. Torn. Frozen. Completely alone in the worst way. Because this wasn't just a mission anymore. This was a girl who whispered "mommy" in her sleep. A father trying to survive grief without breaking. And the knowledge that if she followed orders, both of them would be destroyed before the sun came up. She knew the protocol. How to restrain a civilian. How to sedate a minor without leaving a trace. How to fabricate a medical emergency and transport a target through emergency services without raising suspicion. She knew every step. But knowing didn't mean she could live with it. Because Carrie had a choice to make. Follow the plan. Or burn it all to the ground. The room around her blurred. Not from panic. Not from fear. But from the weight of clarity. Ronnie wasn't the threat. Jessica definitely wasn't. The real threat was the silence she would have to carry if she let this happen. So she closed the message. Wiped the screen. And slowly, deliberately, turned her eyes back to them. Ronnie stirred slightly, then opened his eyes halfway. "You okay?" he mumbled, still half asleep. She nodded. "Yes," she said. "Just thinking." He smiled softly, unaware of the storm brewing inches away. She stared at him for a long moment, then reached into her pocket and pressed her finger against the discreet emergency override hidden in her phone case. One tap. Message sent. Delay extraction. Target under review. Situation evolving. It bought her maybe an hour, maybe less. But it was a start. She didn't know how she was going to protect them yet. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Jessica become a bargaining chip. Not while she was still breathing. And in the darkness of that sterile waiting room, with the hum of machines and the threat of dawn creeping closer, Carrie McKinney made her first real decision. Not as an agent, but as a human being. The words came out steadier than she felt, her voice low, controlled, like she was reading from a script. But inside, every syllable felt like lighting a fuse. She had waited until the hallway was clear, nurses making rounds, Ronnie asleep again with Jessica curled up under his arm, and stepped into the quietest spot she could find, a utility alcove behind pediatrics, where the walls were just thick enough to muffle guilt. She tapped into the secure line and gave her clearance code. Her handler picked up on the second ring, clipped and cold as always. "Go ahead." "Target is clean," she said, no hesitation. No indication of intent or knowledge. "He's clear." A pause. "Then, that's not what the data says." Carrie didn't blink. "The data's incomplete. He's a victim of proximity, not complicity. His daughter is the priority now. I'm recommending we pull surveillance, close the case quietly." Silence. Just long enough for her to feel the weight of what she'd done settle over her like a second skin. "You're confident?" the handler asked. Carrie breathed in slowly. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and regret. "Yes," she said. "I'll file it all in my debrief. There's nothing here." Another pause. The handler didn't confirm. Didn't push. Just ended the call with a flat, "Copy." The line went dead. Carrie exhaled, and for a moment, everything stopped. That was it. A lie so clean, it barely left a mark. One sentence to undo months of surveillance. One call to burn protocol, erase suspicion, and gamble everything on a gut feeling. She should have been terrified. But what she felt instead was something she hadn't touched in years, relief. Until she walked back into the waiting room, and saw Ronnie staring at her. He wasn't asleep. Not anymore. His eyes were open, hazy with exhaustion but locked onto hers with an intensity she hadn't expected. "How long were you gone?" he asked softly. She hesitated. Just needed some air. "You okay?" She nodded too fast. "Yeah, just tired." Ronnie didn't press. Didn't accuse. But there was something in his gaze, curious, maybe even cautious. Like some part of him had begun putting pieces together, even if he didn't know what the puzzle was yet. Carrie sat down next to him, careful to keep her breathing steady, careful to stop her hands from shaking. She wasn't trained to feel like this. Every move she made from now on would be outside protocol, beyond the net of command. But she had made her choice. And now, she had to live inside the consequences. Ronnie looked over at Jessica, who let out a small sigh and shifted in her sleep. "You know," he said after a long silence, "I don't really believe in gut feelings anymore." Carrie tilted her head. "Why not?" "Because they failed me once." He gave a dry smile. "Thought Emily was getting better. Thought the scans looked different. That's what I told myself. But it was just hope. not instinct. And hope, it can trick you into seeing what you want to see. Carrie said nothing, just stared at the floor, the truth of his words scraping at her ribs like broken glass. Sometimes you have to lie to protect someone, he added, almost absently. That made her look up. Fast. His eyes met hers. And though he didn't know what she'd just done, or how close he'd come to losing everything, his daughter, his freedom, his life, something in him seemed to sense it anyway. I get it, he said. People do what they have to. Carrie felt her chest tighten. Not from fear. From recognition. Because whether he knew it or not, he had just absolved her of something he didn't even know she was guilty of. And that forgiveness hit harder than any agency briefing or intel download ever had. So let's be real here. What would you have done in her position? Would you lie to your superior? Risk your entire career? Go off mission to protect a man you were sent to betray? Or would you play it safe, stay loyal to the job, and let the system do what it always does, crush whoever gets in its way? Tell me in the comments. Because decisions like this, they aren't made in briefing rooms. They're made in the quiet spaces between breaths. When someone's life hangs in the balance and you're the only one left holding the scale. Carrie had chosen. But now the clock was ticking. Because somewhere out there, the team still had their eyes on Ronnie. And if they found out what she'd done, they wouldn't just come for him. They'd come for her too. The trust didn't arrive with fanfare. It wasn't grand or loud or obvious. It slipped in quietly, through a look, a breath, a moment. Something changed in the way Ronnie observed her. He noticed how she sat a little too still. How her attention lingered in places people usually ignore. And how when she thought no one was watching, her jaw clenched like she was bracing for something only she could see coming. But it wasn't suspicion in his eyes anymore. It was something softer. Something like understanding. He didn't know what Carrie was carrying. Couldn't have guessed the full weight of the truth. But every bone in his body told him that whatever storm was gathering, she wasn't watching it from a safe distance. She was inside it. And somehow, she was choosing to shield him and Jessica from the worst of it. The minutes crawled by after that. One of the nurses came in to check Jessica's vitals, scribbled something onto her chart, whispered a few words Carrie couldn't quite hear, and left just as quickly. Ronnie glanced at the monitor, his fingers twitching with a helplessness he could barely contain. I hate this place, he muttered, half to himself. Carrie turned her head. The waiting. No. The feeling. His voice was low, gravelly. The knowing there's nothing left to do but wait. No actions. No solutions. Just hoping the people in coats know what the hell they're doing. He chuckled bitterly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. You ever feel like the whole world's moving without you? Like you're stuck in the same loop, and everyone else has somewhere to go except you? Carrie didn't answer right away. Because yes, she had felt that. Every day since her sister's funeral. Every day since she returned from her assignment in Tel Aviv and found out she had missed her last chance to say goodbye. She'd replayed that call 1,000 times. The one she ignored. The voicemail she deleted without listening to. I'll call her next week, she had told herself. And by the time next week came, it was over. So yes, she knew exactly what he meant. You're not stuck, she said softly. Ronnie gave her a sidelong glance. You sound pretty sure of that. Because you're still showing up, she replied. For her. Every second you stay here, holding her hand, whispering her name, that's movement. It may not feel like it, but it's everything. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them no longer heavy, but something closer to sacred. He didn't need Carrie to explain what she'd done. He just needed someone who wouldn't flinch when things got dark. And that's what she was now. The kind of person who stays when most people leave. Carrie leaned back slightly, eyes scanning the ceiling as if searching for something she'd lost years ago. There were no stars in that hospital, no sky, but her gaze wandered anyway, the way it used to when she was little and dreamed of being anything other than what she became. She wanted to tell him everything. She almost did. But where would she even start? Hey Ronnie, I've been lying to you. I'm not Carrie from Boston. I never taught second grade. I'm a trained government operative who thought you were the key to a cyber terror threat. But somewhere along the way, I realized I'd rather protect you than destroy you. And now, the people I used to trust think you're expendable. No. There was no graceful way to drop a truth like that without shattering whatever fragile ground they were standing on. So she did the only thing she could. She stayed quiet. Let the silence wrap around them like a blanket neither of them wanted to shake off. Ronnie leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands locked in front of him like he was holding back a tide. "I keep thinking," he said quietly, "that if Emily were still here, she'd know what to say. She always knew what to say." Carrie smiled, faint and sad. "Maybe you're doing just fine without her words." "Doesn't feel like it." "Maybe that's because you're not giving yourself enough credit." He looked over at her again. Longer this time. Not studying. Not questioning. Just seeing her. And Carrie, for the first time in longer than she could remember, let herself be seen. Really seen. No mask. No filter. No story to hide behind. Just a woman who had made a dangerous choice for reasons she couldn't fully explain. "And Ronnie?" He nodded once. Not to agree, but to say, "I see you too." And in that small, quiet moment, something shifted. Not just trust. Not just understanding. But something unspoken. Something that meant when the worst came for them, when the decisions became impossible and the danger got closer than ever before, they would no longer be facing it alone. That's the kind of disappearance that haunts you, not loud, not dramatic, just an empty space where someone used to be. The day Jessica was cleared to go home, it felt like sunlight cracked through a month of storm. Her fever finally broke. The doctor smiled, real and unforced. The paperwork was signed, and suddenly the hallway that had felt like prison bars now pointed toward the door. Ronnie had expected Carrie to walk out with them, or at least say goodbye. But as he turned around, holding Jessica in one arm and a plastic bag of meds in the other, she was already gone. No trace. No lingering scent of her perfume. No flash of green dress down the corridor. It was like she'd never existed. He checked the bench where they'd spent so many nights. Nothing. He asked the nurses. Nobody had seen her leave. He even doubled back through the ER just to be sure. Still nothing. She had evaporated. He didn't know why it hit him so hard. He'd only known her for a few days, technically. But grief has a strange way of opening you to people. You build trust faster when you're drowning. And Carrie had felt like a lifeboat in the storm. Someone who didn't need explanations, who just stayed. And now? She had vanished with no warning, like a chapter torn from the middle of a story. For the next few days, Ronnie told himself it didn't matter. That she had her own life. Her own reasons. Maybe she was just passing through. Maybe he'd imagined the whole thing being more than it was. But Jessica kept asking, "Where's Carrie?" She'd whisper at bedtime, clutching the worn-out bear to her chest. She said she'd visit us. Ronnie didn't have an answer. So he just said, maybe she will. 3 weeks passed. The days got easier, in that slow, reluctant way grief starts to loosen its grip. Jessica's cheeks returned to color. Ronnie managed to cook something that wasn't canned or microwaved. There were even a few mornings where waking up didn't feel like a chore. And then it happened. He was folding laundry one afternoon. Jessica was at school, and the house was quiet, when he decided to wash the bear. It was overdue. The thing had been dragged through hospitals, car seats, grocery aisles. It needed it. As he opened the stitching along the back, expecting to find a handful of tissues or maybe an old sticker, something else fell out. A phone. No brand. No scratches. Just a small matte black burner, tiny, nondescript, and unmistakably deliberate. His blood turned cold. There was only one message on the screen. No sender. Just a recording waiting to be played. Ronnie stared at it for a long time. Then hit play. Carrie's voice filled the room, soft, steady, and stripped of the practiced tone she always used. "If you're hearing this, it means I had to go. Fast. I can't explain everything, but I need you to trust me one more time. Someone was watching us. Not just me. Others. It got too dangerous. For you, and Jessica." The sound of her breathing hitched, almost like she hadn't wanted to record this at all. "I did what I could. Delayed things. Moved the spotlight. But it won't last forever. Keep Jessica close. Don't trust anyone who asks too many questions about your brother-in-law. If they do, you leave. Immediately." There was a pause, then one final line. "You were never the threat, Ronnie. But you're still in the blast radius. Stay safe." The recording cut. Ronnie didn't move for a full minute. He just stood there, staring at the phone like it might explode. Because in a way, it had. What did it mean? What else was coming? Who were they? And most of all, why had she risked everything? You ever feel like the person you needed most was someone you were never supposed to meet? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever met someone who showed up just long enough to change everything, then disappeared? Because that was Carrie. She came in like a whisper during the worst days of Ronnie's life. And now, she was gone. But not without leaving a warning. Not without leaving proof that everything Ronnie suspected, the stares, the tension, the way she knew more than she ever said, had been real. She wasn't just a kind stranger. She was a shield. And somewhere, wherever she was now, she was still watching. Not from a hospital bench, but from the shadows she'd once belonged to. The sound echoed as the burner clattered to the hardwood floor, landing face up like it was waiting for him to respond. Ronnie's hands trembled, not from fear, at least not the kind he could name, but from the sudden, irreversible shift in reality. Everything he'd tried to push aside, to label as coincidence or paranoia, now settled in with sharp, undeniable clarity. He wasn't crazy. And Carrie wasn't who she said she was. The message had been brief, 10 words, but they carried the weight of something enormous. Something invisible and coiled just beneath the surface. They weren't just being watched. They were being studied, measured, tracked. And if Carrie was reaching out like this, it meant she couldn't protect them from the inside anymore. She'd crossed a line. And she was telling him in her own quiet way that it was his turn to make a move. Ronnie sank to the floor beside the phone, trying to make sense of the timeline. Had it started before the hospital? Was it Alan? Something from Emily's funeral? That encrypted hard drive he'd once found in a shoebox of her brother's and tossed in the back of a drawer, assuming it was just a busted backup? He felt sick. And suddenly, every decision he'd made in the last year seemed like it had been under a microscope. Every school pickup, every late-night pharmacy run, every trip to the grocery store. Was someone tailing him? Watching Jessica? His fists clenched at the thought. Because the message wasn't just a warning, it was a call to stay quiet. But silence felt wrong. Doing nothing felt like giving them permission to close in. So he picked up the phone again, hoping there was more. A text. A file. Anything. But there wasn't. Just that single voice memo. And Carrie's voice, still hanging in the air like smoke. Now it was his turn. He checked Jessica's room. She was curled up, the bear tucked under her arm like always. Peaceful. Unaware. How much longer could he keep it that way? He walked into the kitchen, gripping the burner phone like a weapon, unsure of what to do next. Call the police? No. If Carrie had gone dark, law enforcement either couldn't be trusted, or would only make things worse. He'd seen enough movies, read enough headlines, to know that when the people watching you aren't criminals but suits with access to everything, there's no safety in going public. He had to be smarter than that. He had to think like Carrie. And that terrified him. Because he wasn't built for this. He was a construction guy. A father trying to keep his kid in one piece. But now, he was part of something bigger. Something that didn't care about innocence or context or grief. It only cared about control. He opened the utility drawer in the kitchen, grabbed a screwdriver, and returned to the bear. Carefully, gently, he cut open the seam again, searching for something he might have missed the first time. A second SIM card? A note? Coordinates? Nothing. Just fluff. The phone was the message. Simple. Direct. Coded in trust. She was still out there. And she still believed in him. But how long could she keep that up before they found her? And what would they do to her if they did? Ronnie sat down at the table, the weight of that thought sinking in like cement. He wanted to call someone, anyone, just to say it out loud. She warned me. But there was no one to tell. No one who wouldn't think he'd snapped under the weight of grief and exhaustion. And that's when it hit him. The only person who'd believe him, really believe him, was the one who couldn't come back. Carrie. Wherever she was already sacrificing more than he could imagine. And she'd done it not because she had to, but because somewhere between the coffee and the tears and the silence, she saw something in him that was worth saving. Ronnie leaned back in his chair, staring at the burner phone. It was small, barely the size of his palm. But in that moment, it felt like the only lifeline he had left. And he knew this wasn't the end. This was the middle. The part of the story where the real danger begins. And if you think the next move is simple, if you think he could just go back to his life and forget this warning ever happened, you're not paying attention. Because people like Carrie don't vanish for no reason. They vanish because someone is coming. And Ronnie had to be ready. Life, for all its chaos, has a strange way of pretending to go back to normal. Bills still arrive. Kids still ask for cereal. The sun still rises, even when the world inside your chest refuses to keep turning. Ronnie packed everything they owned into a rusted blue pickup and left before sunrise. No goodbye letters. No calls. No forwarding address. Just a note to his landlord saying they wouldn't be renewing the lease, a half-drunk cup of coffee left on the counter, and the kind of silence you only get when you're leaving behind a life you can't explain. They moved 5 towns over to a quiet, unremarkable place that didn't ask questions. The kind of town where the post office still closed for lunch and the mailman knew your dog's name. It was perfect. Because anonymity doesn't always mean hiding in the shadows. Sometimes it means blending into the background, so well no one ever thinks to look twice. Jessica got enrolled in a small school. Friendly teachers. A playground with a crooked slide. A nurse who actually called to check in after the first week, just to say hello. It was safe. Or at least, it felt that way. Ronnie set up small routines to anchor them. Breakfast at the same time every morning, bedtime stories every night, always locking the doors twice, always parking the truck facing the street. Just in case. Because even if they weren't being watched anymore, the memory of being hunted never really leaves you. He told himself the move was for a better school district. Told neighbors he was starting fresh after a rough year. Everyone nodded politely. No one dug deeper. People are strange that way. They love stories, but only when they're entertaining. Pain makes people uncomfortable. So they let it go. But inside his own walls, Ronnie never forgot. He kept the burner phone hidden inside a hollowed-out book, taped shut and stored beneath the floorboards in the bedroom. Just in case. He never turned it back on. Never answered the unknown number that texted, "Are you safe?" a week after they arrived. Because he didn't know if it was her, or someone pretending to be her. And the truth was, he didn't want to find out. Now, here's something for you. If someone saved your life and disappeared into silence, would you try to find them? Or would you honor the distance they left behind? I want you to drop your answer in the comments. Because some debts can't be repaid in words. Some goodbyes are too sacred to rewrite. Jessica adapted quickly, as kids do. She made a friend named Chloe. Started collecting stickers again. Began sleeping through the night without murmuring for her mother. Ronnie kept the bear close by, stitched up clean now, no sign of the device that once carried Carrie's voice. But every now and then, when Jessica thought he wasn't listening, she'd whisper to it. Like she still believed it could hear her. Ronnie never stopped wondering if Carrie could too. At night when the sky was clear, he'd sit on the porch, beer in hand, and scan the stars, not for meaning, not for comfort, but for something he couldn't explain. Some nights, he imagined she was out there. Maybe not far. Maybe somewhere close. A different town. A new name. Still watching. Still guarding them from a distance. Other nights, he feared the worst. That the reason she never came back was because she couldn't. And that made him sit up a little straighter. Lock the door one extra time. Sleep just a little less. He started writing again. Not anything fancy. Just small notes. Pages he never intended to send. Letters to no one. Sometimes addressed to Carrie. Sometimes to Emily. Sometimes to himself. Pages filled with things like, "She laughed today." Real laugh. Like her mother's. "I made pancakes. She said they were better than Mom's. I lied and said that's what I was going for. If you're out there, thank you. For everything." He tucked them into a box beneath his bed. A collection of truths too fragile to say aloud. Carrie had altered the course of their lives without ever fully revealing herself. She entered their story like a ghost, left with the grace of a shadow, and somehow never truly disappeared. Because protection like that, it leaves a mark. You don't need a badge to be someone's guardian. You don't need a uniform to make someone feel safe. And you definitely don't need a title to change the direction of a person's future. Sometimes, you just have to show up. And when the moment demands it, vanish. Ronnie never told Jessica the full story. Not because he didn't trust her, but because some truths are too heavy to hand to a child still learning how to be brave. Maybe one day. But for now, he let her believe the stranger in green was just a kind woman who sat beside them on the worst night of their lives. And maybe that was enough. Because on the nights when the wind was still and the sky stayed wide open, he'd sit on that porch, look up at the constellations, and quietly hope that wherever she was, Carrie could see the same stars too. Carrie discovered the truth weeks after she vanished. By then, she had burned her badge, wiped her tracking data, and disappeared into her own kind of exile, a place where agents go when they've betrayed the agency, but not themselves. She had risked everything to protect them. And for a while, she'd convinced herself that was enough. But it kept pulling her back. The questions. The silence. The knowledge that the people she once answered to weren't finished. Because when an operation is labeled sleeper, it doesn't die easily. And Carrie knew, deep in her gut, that walking away hadn't shut the door. It had simply given Ronnie and Jessica a head start. She needed to know the truth. So she hacked her own clearance. It wasn't easy. She had to break into a ghost server tethered to an old safe house in Madrid. One that shouldn't have even been online anymore. But inside, there it was, the full file. The unredacted version. Not the brief they fed her during the assignment. Not the edited narrative meant to keep her focused on Ronnie. The real thing. And when she opened it, everything clicked. The timestamps. The anomalies. The unexplained gaps in Alan Drexler's digital trail. It hadn't been about Ronnie at all. It was Jessica. Not because she had done anything, but because, during those months when Alan was living in their home, dying sister in one room, his niece playing in another, he was hiding something. Something he couldn't store on a cloud or send in a message. So he improvised. He turned Jessica into the vault. Carrie's breath caught when she read it. Jessica had a photographic memory. It was in her medical file, something most parents might see as a quirky gift. But to Alan, it was a failsafe. A 6-year-old who could watch a series of numbers and unconsciously commit them to memory without even realizing what she was seeing. He hadn't told anyone. Not even Ronnie. But during those long afternoons in the living room, when Jessica sat on his lap watching cartoons, Alan was showing her more than episodes. He was embedding something. A visual cipher, broken into flashes, patterns, colors. It was genius. It was cruel. And it meant Jessica was the last living key to a string of code capable of dismantling security firewalls across multiple governments. Carrie felt sick. Not just because they'd been lied to, but because now she understood why the agency wouldn't let it go. Why the burner message she'd sent to delay extraction didn't trigger an automatic shutdown. They didn't want Ronnie. They wanted the code. And the code lived inside a little girl who still whispered to her teddy bear at night. That's why they let Carrie go quiet. Why they didn't hunt her down the second she bailed. They were waiting. Hoping she'd lead them to Jessica again. She closed the file. Deleted every trace. And felt her hands shaking. The agency had sent her in blind. Fed her a story. Let her get close to a man they didn't actually care about, knowing full well the danger lay in the eyes of the child he carried in his arms. And suddenly it made sense. Why they approved the use of leverage. Why Jessica had become a necessary pressure point. It was never about coercion. It was containment. Carrie looked out the window of her safe house, eyes scanning the horizon like she expected them to come for her at any moment. Because now she wasn't just a rogue agent. She was the only one who knew where the cipher was hidden. Not in a hard drive. Not on paper. But in a child who still couldn't tie her own shoes without double knots. And now, she had a decision to make. Stay hidden. Or go back. Because if the agency figured out where Ronnie had taken Jessica, and they would eventually, they wouldn't ask questions next time. They'd extract the information by any means necessary. And this time, there wouldn't be any burner phone warnings. There wouldn't be any soft lies or hospital benches. Just action. Just silence. And Carrie knew she couldn't let that happen. She had left them once. But now, she might be the only one who could keep them safe. For real. So she packed her bag, tucked a worn photo of Jessica into her pocket, and disappeared into the night. Because the truth was out. And Jessica Barnes was the most valuable child on the planet. The only question left was, who would find her first? The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no tearful goodbye, no monologue into a mirror. Just a fire. A quiet one. In the woods behind a cabin she hadn't stepped foot in since her training days. The badge, the encrypted tablet, the ID under a name that hadn't been hers in years, gone in a few controlled flames. She watched the plastic curl and blacken until nothing was left but smoke. And with that, Carrie McKinney stopped being property of the agency, and became a woman with a promise to keep. The drive was long. A blur of towns that all looked the same, rest stops, gas stations, diners with pie that tasted like loneliness. She had to go off-grid, reroute through burner cars and forgotten backroads. Because the second she opened that file, she put herself on the radar. And she knew how they worked. She had trained them. They'd already begun the search. They'd flagged school systems, bank accounts, pediatricians, even library cards. Ronnie couldn't hide forever, not with Jessica carrying that information in her mind like a ticking digital time bomb. But Carrie had one advantage they didn't. She knew how Ronnie thought. Because she had watched him break. She had watched him rebuild. And she knew exactly where a man like that would go to protect his daughter. So she followed the trail not in data, but in instinct. And finally, after 7 days of dead ends, fake IDs, and sleeping in the back seat of a stolen SUV, she found them. Small town. Middle of nowhere. Just as she expected. The house was modest, tucked into a row of identical homes with peeling paint and wind chimes that danced like secrets in the wind. There was a yellow bicycle on the lawn. A chalk drawing on the driveway. A teddy bear perched in the window like a sentinel. Jessica's bear. She didn't knock. Not at first. She just stood across the street, eyes fixed on the door, letting the weight of the moment settle into her bones. Because what came next would change everything, again. When she finally did step onto the porch, her hand hovered over the doorbell for a second too long. Then, with a deep breath, she pressed it. The door opened before the chime even finished. Ronnie stood there. Older? No. Just tired in a different way. Like he'd aged more in fear than in years. And in that moment, he didn't look angry. He looked relieved. And that almost broke her. He stepped aside. Said nothing. She entered. The house smelled like cinnamon and worry. Lived in. Safe. Jessica sat on the couch, hugging the bear. She looked up, and when she saw Carrie, she smiled like it was the most normal thing in the world. You came back. Carrie's throat clenched. Of course I did. Ronnie leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes hard now. How bad is it? Carrie didn't sugarcoat it. They know. Not everything. But enough. And Jess. She's the key. That was the moment it stopped being theory for him. The moment it became real. He didn't ask how. Didn't ask why. He just nodded, jaw tight. What do we do? And there it was. Not what do I do. What do we do? That one word, we, was all the confirmation Carrie needed. She told him the truth. Everything. The file. The cipher. The backdoor code hidden in Jessica's subconscious. The fact that once that knowledge is triggered, once she's exposed to certain symbols, images, phrases, it could all come flooding back. It wouldn't be obvious. It might come through dreams, doodles, numbers repeated without knowing why. And once it surfaces, they won't stop until they have her. Ronnie listened in silence. His face didn't change, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped the back of the chair. So what, you help us disappear? Carrie nodded. I know how. I know where. And I have just enough leverage left to buy us a window. We. She hesitated. I'm not leaving you again. He studied her, unsure. Then something shifted. Jessica trusts you, he said. That's enough for me. And just like that, the air changed. No more hiding. Now, it was an escape. Together.
Thanks so much for watching till the end. If this story moved you, you're going to love what's coming next. It's even more surprising and emotional than this one. Go ahead and click the story on your screen right now, and see you in the next story.